Hey, welcome to round two of our National Championships 2020. Now, in this game, I was playing on the white side against Mr. Clinton Fomevor. He was the ninth seed coming into the tournament, but also very grossly underrated. So a dangerous opponent. But I felt a bit more comfortable than I did in the first round because in this game I would be white, and so I could dictate with more surety how the game would progress. So let's get into the game. I played one e4. He responded with the Sicilian, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, Rossolimo. Now, I knew before the game that he played the knight c6 Sicilian and prepared to go into these very lines. But his response, queen b6, wasn't really one that I considered closely. I don't know exactly what I prepared at this point, but it wasn't in any of these lines. So from here, I was on my own. I played knight c3. He played a6. I took the knight, and then I castled. The point here is that after d6 and d4, I'm opening up the position in the center. I've already castled. I'll develop most of my pieces. But the problem with black is that he's behind in development. Black can still justify this play. It's a line that is played, but then he needs to know exactly how to make use of the dynamic compensation that he gets. Because in terms of development, he's really just very, very badly behind. So he started with the bishop g4. Now I push d5. Now the reason in many Sicilians that when you play d4, they tend to take is so that you can't advance the pawn with d5. It gives you a lot of potential. Revolving around the move e5, be able to prepare it at a good time. You basically get a strategically winning position, and that's exactly what the rest of my game revolved around. Now after queen c7, h3 to take out the bishop a little, bishop h5, now bishop f4, controlling the square e5, preparing the push e5. Black is still very, very badly underdeveloped. He went knight f6, rook e1, preparing e5. Of course, the computer points out here that I could actually have already what's the move here? Pushed with like a g4 after knight f6, like g4, bishop goes back, and then already I could play e5. Which I think I might have seen, but playing like h3, g4 this early in the game when your opponent hasn't yet castled and can play something like h5 and castle long and change the position of the game. I mean, it's very good for white, of course, but these are not the kinds of waters that I like to swim in, especially in classical chess. Rook e1 is a very stable advantage, still very good for white, preparing the same idea of e5. Now he had to solve the problem of stopping e5. One common idea in these Sicilians is to play e5 yourself as black. But in this particular position, I'm not sure that it's any good. After pawn takes, which is, and then pawn takes, it's not too bad, but I think I can just play e5 anyways. That has to be it, and that still looks quite good for white. And anything else is quite slow. It's difficult to see exactly how to do it. What you want to do is play knight back to control the square a bit more. But then so he played that in combination with a different idea. So he started with bishop f3, taking away one of my controllers of the e5 square. And after queen takes, he played knight d7. And at least for now, he has stopped the move e5. But again, because he has to focus on these threats without completing his development, his position remains quite bad. I just play queen g3, adding the queen to the control of the e5 square. Now e5 is threatened yet again. He responded with g6 to try and develop the bishop this way, since e6 would be very bad for black. And the bishop here would also add to the control of the square e5, but the move g6 was a blunder already. The position is already very, very bad, so it's got to call it a blunder, but it allows the move e5 to be played immediately. The point being here that after pawn takes, I take back in a slightly surprising manner. You can try and pause the video and figure out how you should take back on e5 here. I'll give you a few seconds. But yeah, I was supposed to take with the rook, which I found. I was quite happy on finding this. And here his position is just is completely lost actually. The reason is the knight cannot take bishop, because bishop takes forks the queen and the rook. So you're going to get your material back with interest, and his skin is going to be unsafe forever. So this is not an option. And he has to get out of the diagonal now, because I'm threatening to take on e7 with check and win the queen. And so he had to play the move queen d8. Now if you have to play this move, you know a lot of things have gone wrong with the position. It's just horrible. Now my knight is actually, my rook is actually sort of hanging, so I brought back to e2, not to e1, to e2, just to give me the opportunity of doubling at the future point. He played bishop g7, and then I just doubled on the e file. Here the computer points out is an even better continuation, starting with bishop c7. Very tricky because the queen has only one square, and now do you double now? I'm not entirely sure. I think now you double. The point being that he can't castle because of some pressure that you put on the e7 square. And I thought I was doing something similar by playing just rook e1, right? Because if he castles, I still take on e7. But here it's slightly different because he can give it up. And after rook e7, he continued with b5. Make no mistake, this is completely winning for white. You already have the material advantage. You have much better pieces. He has only one piece worth writing home about. You already have a passed pawn. I pushed d6. I think at this point the position was like +6. But I managed to mess it up somehow. You can watch and be as amazed as I am. So after knight f6, I play bishop e5. The idea being just to pin the bishop to the knight. Remember I mentioned black's bishop here is one of the few decent pieces that he has, and I just want to trade it off. It's very simple. Here I'm already material ahead. I don't really have to think up any huge plans. I just need to neutralize whatever counterplay that he has, and then win a fairly straightforward endgame. So he was uncomfortable with this pressure. He played 98, allowing me to exchange. And after knight takes, my knight could advance into his position basically unrestrained, eyeing this juicy f6 square. c7 is also decent, and yeah, position is just all kinds of winning. He played knight f5, hitting my rook, hitting my pawn, and also hitting my queen. And I think I underestimated this move. I started with knight f6, but after king h8, already all of a sudden it's difficult to find a good move. I mean, basically all your beautiful pieces are hit, right? How do you defend all of them? Because each one of these three is hanging because of that one knight. Eventually I came up with queen e5 after a lot of thought. The engine still likes white here. I mean, it's still like +6, but the reason it's +6, you have to find a crazy sequence starting with queen g5, and after the queen takes on g6. What's the move here? Oh, I know this. So you start with rook here. The king goes here. Basically, the king has to stay attacking. The queen has to stay attacking my knight on f6, which will stop me from going for any possible mates on the h7 square. So here I go rook here, and my threat is to take this knight, and after pawn takes, queen takes back, and now I'm threatening checkmate on h7 that he can't defend against. So here he plays what does he play here? Something crazy. I mean, this threat is very difficult to meet. I think that the solution is knight h6. It's like an only move, because now if I take, he takes my knight, and now I can't threaten h7 any longer. And so he goes, yeah, I mean, it's a crazy engine line, but basically this was the only way to one of the only ways to keep my advantage. So the move queen e5 that I did play was only like a +1.5 or so, which, I mean, it's still very good, but it's a far cry from the position that we had a few moves earlier. So my pawn on d6 just fell for nothing, and here again I thought a lot, because it looked like it was just neutralizing my initiative, and he was forcing queens off basically. His king, although it looks like it's in grave danger with the reveal, you realize after a few lines that there is no reveal that wins the game on the spot here, and so you actually do have to trade queens. So now you have to try and rely on some sort of endgame. So after a lot of thoughts and disgust with myself, I must say, I found the move knight e7 check. And the point is that the queens will go off all right. Queen takes e5, but after I take back with my rook, my knight is attacking both your rook and the pawn, and my rook acts in attack such that you have to give up a pawn basically. So I can at least play an endgame a pawn up for my troubles. So he played rook fd8. The knight was able to take on c5. He played rook d2, infiltrating. I simply faced his rook and didn't allow him to take control of my rank. He exchanged rooks and then played a5. Yeah, he wants to move the rook and activate it, of course, but he can't do so long as the pawn remains on a6 because my knight is eyeing that pawn. So he probably played a5 to free his rook. I played c3. I think maybe just taking this d4 square away from his knight. And then he used that pawn as a hook to play b4. All fine, all good. Here also I have a decision to make. I can take, but after it takes, all of a sudden my a2 pawn is slightly annoying to defend. And if I play b3, my passed pawn becomes a backward pawn in a2, which is really not what you want. He has ideas of playing like here, 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 and eventually winning that pawn. So I did not want this to happen. So I had to figure out something else to do. Again, I don't want him to take on c3 and make my pawn isolated and slightly weaker than it is right now. So I came up with the idea of c4. Seemingly dropping the pawn after rook c8, but then my point was that I play knight b7 and I exchanged the c pawn for the a pawn so that my extra pawn remains and it's not blockaded, it's not backward, it's not as weak. So he played rook c1, king h2, and then the rook came back. My knight came to b3, the rook came to c4 defending his pawn. I played rook d2. Not entirely sure why. I mean, it's been many months. I can't remember what my thought process was with each move, but probably just sidestepping some knight d4. I mean, in this position, if you're able to play knight d4 and coerce this exchange, then you're a pawn up in a rook endgame, which is a very different thing from being a pawn up in this particular position. Rook endgames being famously trash. So rook d2, he went back to c8. His idea was to swing his rook over to the a file and attack my a pawn because a3 doesn't defend the pawn, which is not a bad idea, but he has spotted a repetition to that idea. So I played g4, threatening his knight, taking the now that my rook has taken away these squares away from the knight is only left with squares that seem much worse. So the knight chose h4, threatening this check. Never too late to lose the game. So I play rook g3 and then he played g5. And yeah, I thought, yeah, this knight is basically out of action now, so I have to be winning. I play rook d4. It's almost impossible to hold that pawn down now. If he tries to defend the rook b8, the rook is hopelessly passive and you can swing your knight into d3 and attack the pawn one more time. So he played rook a8 to try and attack my pawn, like I mentioned, but then I'd spotted the move knight c1 ahead of time. And I'd seen that after this, he basically cannot defend his pawn and he has to go 2 pawns down, which is much more clearly winning. But he came up with some very nice counterplay. He played rook c8. I played knight d3, hitting that pawn once again. Now the pawn is lost. And he played rook c2. Yeah, I expected something like b3. The idea being that if I take, my pawns become doubled. Slightly weaker than they are right now. But yeah, I plan to play either a3 or a4, just leaving the pawn. I'll pick it up later comfortably and I'll still keep my connected passed pawns. So he started with rook c2 instead. And here I hadn't really foreseen his idea until it was a bit late. I just took the pawn. I mean, who wouldn't, right? But then he played rook d2, hitting my knight. I played rook d4 to defend. Here apparently the correct move was to go like a knight e5 and it's like +8 or something here. But I played rook d4. It seemed a bit natural, getting out of the other pawn. I'm ready to play b4, b5, b6, b7, b8, GG. And he went rook d1, and this is when I realized that he had threats of his own that I'd ignored. Basically, my king is in a bit of a box, right? This pawn takes away this square. The knight is protected by the pawn. The knight takes away these 2 squares. And he can play something like rook g8 check. Rook g1 check, sorry. And it's very uncomfortable. You'd have to play king h2. Then after knight h3, you'll be dropping your rook for one thing. He can just check you. And yeah, you don't want this to happen to you. So I played f4. basically with the idea of freeing up this f2 square for my king, so that whenever this check comes, I rather bring my king out this way. He played h6, holding down that g5 pawn. I took, he took, and then I just backed my king out of the corner, volunteering that so that he would never get any of these ideas with rook g1 any longer. And now again, I'm ready to push b4, b5 to 8. Here he played rook d2 check. My king came up, and then the rook came to the other side to hit this weak h2 pawn. But I thought this was a severe mistake actually, because after my natural response knight f2, the knight holds down these squares, the king holds down the knight, and his rook is kind of stuck, right? And by the time the rook is to maneuver itself out of the way, my pawns are going to be racing down the board. So he had to play f5. I mean, it's completely lost, but it's forced basically. He has to try something like this. I decided to ignore him and go a4. He went knight g2 check, king f3, knight e1 check, a few checks, king came to e2, and now the knight didn't really have a good square to go to, and he played f takes g4, leaving his knight hanging. I'm not sure exactly how much time I had left on the clock here, but I didn't really see any danger in this position. I just took the piece, which was a very bad blunder, because after his move g3, all of a sudden I realized that it's impossible to save my knight and stop the pawn at the same time, because wherever I move my knight, he goes g2, and no one can stop the pawn. Wait, actually someone can stop the pawn. What is this? He starts with a check. That's the key. Very important check. And after my king goes up, now he plays g2, and now no one can stop the pawn from queening. So this was the threat with g3. I think the best move was to like leave the knight alone, but yeah, that's a difficult decision to make. I played knight d3, and here I only calculated g2. I think I was already quite low on time here, but then he started with rook h1 check, and after king e2 g2, in a very similar position to one I just showed, the pawn cannot be stopped. So I was forced to give up my rook with rook g4, and after g1 takes, rook takes. This position is again completely equal. It's a drawn end game, and yeah, like you can imagine, I was feeling very, very, very disgusted with myself. I probably didn't have too much time to cry too much about it. It was probably good, in that I would just have to get on with it and think about it later. But yeah, from the dominating position that we had early in the middle game, you can imagine from like let me find out, after like d6. Where's d6? After like this position, I mean, you should just crush your opponent here. It should be easily winning. But yeah, all of a sudden here it was difficult. So I didn't really have any choice but to try and push my pawns. That was the only way I could try and still win. So I played a5. The rook came to a1, b4, king g8, knight c5 to support the pawn going up one more square. Rook a3, cutting off my king. And the problem here is that my pawns get stuck. There's simply no way to continue pushing them up onto the top of the board. Now, what he should have played here was rook b1 and target rather the weak base of my pawn structure rather than the strong. What do they call the head of the pawn structure? I'm going to call it the head. So yeah, whenever I want to attack a pawn chain, it's easier to attack the base rather than the apex, because the other pawn protects it. So whenever you're attacking this one, the pawn has natural protection. But you attack this one and you realize that the pawn starts to look very silly. So here I would have been forced to bring my knight back, and now he can just sit. He can bring his king in, and I can't advance the pawn. He can take. And the point is, if I advance this pawn too far, he just brings the king, because again I can't advance this pawn. If I ever advance that pawn, he just plays rook here, and then the pawn is lost for nothing. And now that the knight is tied to this guy, the knight can't go ahead to support anyone. So yeah, this would have paralyzed my pawns and the position would have been drawn. But he tried this way, cutting off my king instead. But then my pawns just kept going on. a6, and if you do nothing, I mean, I play b5, I play b6, I play b7, and I queen. So he wasted time to go and take my pawn on h3, giving himself also a passed pawn, and he might have thought that would be enough counterplay, but it simply wasn't enough. And I think from here I was winning once again. After b5, the rook tried to come back, but simply b6. He played g4, but after b7, he played g3, and then he resigned. Because he can't stop the pawn from queening. He can't even play rook b3 because the square is covered by a knight. So yeah, a bit of a roller coaster game. The opening went very smoothly. I had a beautiful position, completely winning, and I should have, but didn't go smoothly at all. I made too many mistakes, and I gave the win away more than once, which is not what you want. But in the end, I still managed, and after 2 rounds, I was 2 out of 2, and yeah, still in contention, but yet to play any of the real heavy hitters. So thank you very much for tuning in. This was round 2. Round 3 will be uploaded shortly. Leave a comment, drop a like. Tell me any lines that I might have missed. Thank you for tuning in once again. See you later. Happy chessing.